Right, welcome. I'm Michelle. I am a grant analyst in GCA, and on behalf of the grant analyst team, welcome to our GCA Spring Forum. So just a few reminders, please make sure you're muted because you want to reduce the background noise. And then also we prepared this forum for you. So if you have any questions during the forum, please feel free to throw them into the chat. And then after each session, we'll take some time to go over your questions. Today's agenda, we're going to start off with a few quick updates from GCA, followed by an introduction to ECC from MAA. And then we're going to cover a few award closeout topics, including final action date, deficit versus expense transfers, surplus budgets, and early terminations and relinquishments. So I will jump into the updates. So we have two. The first one is the Federal Unique Entity Identifier, which replaced the DUNS. So the DUNS is basically a business identifier. It's something we had included, on our invoices or in some of our report forms, such as the SF425. And last month, this was replaced by something called the Unique Entity Identifier. So what GCA has been doing is updating our invoice and report forms to include this number in place of the DUNS. So this won't impact most of you out there since you don't prepare invoices or reports, but in case you do and you had been referencing the DUNS number previously, it's important to replace that with the UEI number. And just one thing to point out is that there are two numbers. One is specific to Department of Education awards, and the other one is for any other award. And in case you need to reference this number in the future, it's on OSP's website on their institutional facts and rates page. Our next update is regarding the Washington State estimate letters, and this is specific to State of Washington awards. So for the state's fiscal year end requirements, they need us to submit either an invoice or an estimate of costs incurred through June 30th by the deadline specified on their website. And then this year, their cutoff is July 25th. So since our month close doesn't really align with their cutoff, we may need to send out an estimate letter of expected costs. So then the agency on their end, they can encumber those amounts for when we issue the actual invoice. So what to expect? If you have a Washington State award, you might receive a notice from the sponsor asking either for an invoice or an estimate. And if you do, let us know. You can send it either to GCA Help or through Grant Tracker. And on GCA side, we'll also be going through all the Washington State awards to determine which ones require an estimate letter versus an invoice. And if we need anything from you, we would reach out to you towards mid-June or so. And just a friendly side note on this, make sure you have all your contacts set up correctly in Grant Tracker, so then you receive these notices when we send them out. And we ask that you respond to our request by the end of June, as we want to send these estimate letters out by July 11th. So then we can meet the state's cutoff. And as noted previously, if we don't, invoice for these amounts or encumber them, then there's a possibility that the state might not be able to pay for them, when we send out the invoice later on. Okay, so that's all the updates we have this time. And now we'll move on to Introduction to ECC from Colleen in MAA.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, so what is ECC? It is going to be our new effort reporting system. ECC stands for Employee Compensation Compliance. It's a third-party solution that we're purchasing from Huron. And this is part of the overall, finance transformation. We looked at some different options as to what to do with effort reporting, and we made the decision to go with a proven third-party solution. Next slide, please. Can we move the next? There we go. Here we go. So how will ECC impact users? Well, obviously, we hope that this will be a positive net change for everyone, but it will be a change. We can't get around that. There are a couple of reasons we selected ECC. We wanted to go for a platform that would support multiple processes and also one that's scalable. We anticipate Right now, we have about 5,000 users across campus, and we expect that to grow to up to 10,000 users, and the ECC platform will support that. Next slide, please. Some of the benefits to doing this, it will standardize workflows. So again, we're trying to look at a single platform that will support faculty, non-faculty, support the functionality for hard review as well as APL. So we'll have a standardized workflow. We're going to automate and use electronic records for all effort reporting. We're going to improve compliance through real-time reporting and timely notification. So the system will be have a feed directly into Workday. And then also within the ECC platform, there's a lot of workflows that will initiate automatic notifications and communications with campus. So it just hopefully streamline the process. We're looking to simplify the user interface and the user experience. Again, having a common platform that supports the multiple functionalities. We hope that that will make it easier and more effective for the end user, always driving towards the goal of having increased uniformity and consistency across campus. Next slide, please. The impacts, well, of course, there's impacts. With all of this comes new workflows, new reporting capabilities, new reporting options, and a new user interface. So how do we address that? Next slide. We need user input. And I think this is the biggest part of the message I want to communicate. We understand that this is a change. We understand everyone's faced with multiple changes with FT, but we want to try to get engagement. We are looking for ECC champions. We want to hear from the community, what works well in today's environment? What do you like? What are those pain points? You know, what are things that are giving you grief that I can't guarantee that we'll design a perfect system that will meet everything that ails, but we want to have feedback. We want to incorporate as many of the capability and functionality of ECC to make this system really support the needs of campus. So we need to hear from you. We're making a call for champions. Champions would participate in design discussions, focus groups, surveys. They'll also participate in user acceptance testing. So please, if you're interested in doing that, please email us at ecchelp@uw.edu, and we'll be in contact with you to help you understand what that role would be and how you can help us help you. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of where we are in this project, we just had a project kickoff April of, well, that would be last month of this year. We're targeting to get into cycle 3 end-to-end testing, which is in October of 22. User acceptance testing, we anticipate will be spring of 23, and then we will have it concurrent go live with the Workday ERP system July of 23. We're partnering with ECC to ensure that the ECC champions, to ensure that y'all are engaged in the solution so it doesn't just thud on your desk, July 1. We want you to be part of the process so that you have feedback and knowledge and that you really have ownership of the system. We obviously will maintain critical functionality. At the end of the day, this is a compliance tool, so we will meet those requirements. But we'll also look to automate processes and workflows, have standardized reporting, hopefully make the overall experience easier. We will be providing training materials. We'll document all the workflows and processes so that there will be, as people move into different positions and different roles, we hope to have a really comprehensive suite of documentation and training so people can be onboarded relatively quickly and engage in the system rather quickly when they enter a new position. And we also want to maintain transparency through this process. You will see a lot of communication. We have a fantastic organizational change management team that will be producing a lot of collateral, keeping people updated on where we are, what are the decisions. We also will be developing a dashboard, so there'll be a central place for people to go see where we are, look at documentation, and as training and those things roll out, we want them readily available. Next slide, please. So what's next? As I mentioned, we kicked off the project last month. We're now in the very data heavy design phase. So the integrations team is working with Huron and our Workday teams to work through all those data mapping and all that integration work. We'll continue to collaborate with Huron to define responsibilities and deliverables. We're establishing communication and organizational change management plans, so you'll be hearing from us quite a bit. And again, as I mentioned, we're developing a dashboard, so there'll be one place where people can go in and check on the progress of the implementation. Next slide. I'm just going to go quickly. We just did this presentation a couple weeks ago to MRAM, and we had several questions. So it was suggested that maybe we go over those questions and answers. And then, of course, if y'all have any questions, we can take them now, or you can email to the ECC help email, and we'll get a response back to you. So real quick, how will GCRs change when ECC implements effects? So GCCRs will move to an automated process today. As you all know, it's a report generated process. So that will be automated. The specifics of how that workflow will work, we don't have those details, but we will be providing that information on the dashboard once that's available. What are the 4 systems that ECC will replace? ECC will replace effort reporting systems and or existing processes for faculty, non-faculty, Harborview, and the Applied Physics Lab. Is Huron a solution custom or off the shelf? So it is an off the shelf solution, and that was one of the drivers in selecting Huron, so we didn't want to build something from scratch. We'd rather have something that had been out in our peer organizations and had kind of been, road tested, as it were. So we didn't have to go through, be the first ones through the wall. Next slide. When will the old system be retired? Will there be overlap? So I can tell you the general philosophy. Again, lots of details have not been worked out. Our plan is to have the reporting periods for all users end in the existing system June 30 of 23, and then we'll start the first reporting cycle in the new system beginning July 1, 23. Obviously, there's lots of details to work out. That's a shortened cycle for some the folks on campus. We have to work through the whole issue of salary transfers and any other recertifications. So we have a team working on that. And again, we'll be providing information, and we'll also be soliciting feedback as we develop ideas on how to handle this transition. Again, we welcome your feedback, like, hey, this won't work because of this. Please let us know, so we can factor that into our process mapping. Do other peer institutions use ECC along with Workday? Again, another big factor in selecting Huron, yes. We have University of Miami and University of Kansas Medical Center both use Workday and ECC. And in fact, we do a lot of collaboration and are gathering lessons learned from our peers at University of Miami. So it's turning out to be a very powerful tool in our implementation to kind of understand what they did and maybe garner from them things they would do different, knowing what they know now. Next slide. ECC stands for Employee Compensation Compliance. Then the next question is, GCCs will be automated. Do you mean it will be automated for each PI? Will GCCR coordinators who currently download reports and get signatures no longer be needed? So we know that it will be automated. So the current process of downloading the reports will not be part of the workflow in future state. Beyond that, any specifics about roles and responsibilities in that workflow process have not been determined. Again, we'll be posting those things once we have them available, and encourage if folks have ideas on how that would, be designed effectively or things that work well, please send us that information on our email. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to read this one, but this is a sample of what we love to get from campus right now. This was a comment from campus saying this particular use case is kind of a pain point. So we appreciate that. We put it in, we've documented, we've issued a JIRA ticket for it, and we will consider this as we work through the design process. If you have other situations that work or don't work, please let us know so we can issue a ticket and incorporate it in the design process. Next slide. Oh, I do have one operational announcement. So this is current state. So beginning this week, we are implementing a standard 2-hour maintenance window that will be in effect every Tuesday from 7 to 9. So from 7 to 9 going forward on Tuesdays, effects may not be available if there is any sort of updates or production work that needs to happen. And next slide. Again, can you tell we want your engagement? We really want to hear from you, and now is the time. We're very much in the infancy of all workflow and system design. So if you have comments, thoughts, ideas, please email us. We welcome the feedback. All right. Do we take questions now, or are we going to wait till the end? Michelle, how does that work?
We'll go over questions now.
Okay.
And it looks like we do have a question from Belinda Sachs. Any information on how the ECCs will be amended to reflect OSETs?
So, I mean, the ECC will have a recertification process, and we are mapping how that will work. I'm not sure if you mean in that transition when we're moving from current state to future state. That process we're working out right now. We're considering some different factors. One may be a very rudimentary paper process, but again, none of those designs have been finalized.
We have another question. Will effort that is cost share be handled in ECC?
So I'm not 100% on that. I know that we're doing cost share a little bit differently in Workday, and so we're working with that team to understand how best to handle that sort of effort. So those, again, designs haven't been finalized, but we'll post this and get this answered as it gets finalized on our dashboard.
And it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So we'll move on to the next topic. Final action date by Patrick.
Ready. Good morning, everyone. So I'll start off. So what is the final action date? The final action date, or FAD for short, is the last day that the budget will remain open for the department to post expenditures. After the final action date has passed, your budget will automatically change from status 1, which is open to expenses, to status 3, which is closed to expenses. Next slide, please. So what determines the final action date? The final action date is determined by the due date of your budget's final report and/or the final invoice laid out in the award agreement. The final action date is before this date to allow GCA time to prepare the final reconciliation for the report or invoice. The date is typically set as about 6 days before the final invoice due date, or 3 weeks before the final report. So how does the final action date impact you? Once the final action date has passed, a budget is eligible for invoicing or reporting on the expenditure level at that date. Any charges that post after this date will not be included on the final report, invoice, or letter of credit draw. GCA can consider submitting a revised report or invoice when there are extenuating circumstances, but please note that the sponsor is not obligated to accept a late or revised report or invoice, and any deficit caused by this is the responsibility of the department. So one common question that we get is what happens when the final action date is before my budget end date? This can occur most frequently when the final report is due the same date as the budget end date. When this occurs, the budget will still flip to status 3 after the final action date and close to expenses. GCA asks that you notify us of any pending charges ahead of time that will occur. so we can include them on our final reconciliation. We will then open the budget back up to allow the charges to post and send off the report. Are there any questions?
If no questions, we'll move on to the next topic, deficit versus expense transfers with Azalea.
Thank you, Michelle. So should I do an expense transfer or a deficit transfer? This tends to be a really common question that we get from campus quite frequently, especially during the closeout process. You know, it's like, what's the difference? Does it matter? So both transfers do pose possible audit risks to the UW and your department. So I'm hoping in this presentation, I'm going to arm you with enough information to help you decide which transfer is best in whatever situation you are facing. Next slide. So an expense transfer. An expense transfer is literally the act of moving an expense. So in the UW system, there are actually 3 types of expense transfers that you guys can perform in MyFD. So one is moving an expense from one budget to another, moving an expense from one object code to another, so that can still stay on the same budget, and moving an expense from one project cost accounting code to another, often known as PCA codes, and that would be also within the same budget. Next slide. So an expense transfer should only be performed for the following 2 reasons. Number 1, you are correcting an error where an expense is initially posted on the wrong budget, or you must reallocate an expense that benefits more than one budget, but could only be posted to one budget at the time of purchase. And this tends to happen a lot with like Ariba purchases or rent. You know, you might have like 20 budgets that it needs to be allocated to, and that's just not plausible. So sometimes you just have to do it on one and then do the transfers afterwards. Next slide. So to internal and external auditors, excessive transfers can be a red flag because expense transfers can be an indication that the budget isn't routinely being reconciled. It's also an indication of weakness in a department's internal controls. This red flag would call into question the department's intentions and if transfers are being used to move costs for budgetary convenience. So before I move on, I would like to say a few words about budgetary convenience. It's a pretty broad term, but the way I like to define it is the act of using a budget just because you can and not because you should. So there are 2 specific actions that tend to come to mind when I think about budgetary convenience. One is spending down a budget because there's a balance at the end of the ward, and also parking charges temporarily until the correct budget number becomes available. Both of these things have consequences. So if the charges are not reasonable, allocable, or allowable for that budget, you really should not charge them. Next slide. So sure, well, it's easy for me to say expense transfers are bad and don't do them. The reality is things are not perfect and expense transfers are needed from time to time. So there are steps you can take to decrease the risk associated with expense transfers. Reconcile your budgets monthly to identify erroneous expenditures in a timely manner. Make transfers as soon as you can. If you can do them quickly, you won't have to provide an explanation as to why the transfer is being done late. If the error is caused by an internal or external goods provider, follow up with them immediately as the correction could take some time to process. For transfers that are processed after 120 days, you should provide a very detailed explanation as to why it is being done late. You might also want to think about steps that your department will take going forward to make sure errors are identified quicker. Make sure to keep good backup documentation to support your transfers in case of audit. Backup should provide convincing evidence that the goods or services are properly allocated and the budget actually received a benefit from those goods and services. Next slide. So to wrap up my discussion on expense transfers, please keep in mind, a single cost is not to be transferred more than once. For faculty salaries that have already been certified, the faculty effort certification report needs to be recertified for that faculty member. And for non-faculty personnel, the expense transfers need to be noted on the next quarterly grant and contract certification report, also known as the GCCRs. Next slide. So now in this presentation, I'm going to go over deficit transfers. So what exactly is a deficit and how do I know I have one? A deficit balance occurs when total expenditures exceed the total authorized amount for a sponsored agreement. This also includes budget allocations. As you know, that we do have some sponsors that are very strict with their rebudgeting rules, and so you have to keep that in mind as well. Or when expenditures are uncollectible from the sponsor due to non-performance. So deficits do not include the negative budget balance resulting from unliquidated encumbrances. Next slide. There are so many reasons as to why deficits occur on a budget. The most popular reason or common reason is when the direct expenditures of a project exceed the authorized amount. So in this case, you more than likely have under budgeted the cost of the project, or as you're actually doing the project, it costs more than you thought it would. The second most popular reason is due to sponsor non-payment that results in a cash deficit. So for example, upon review of an invoice, unallowable or disallowable costs are found, and the sponsor reaches out and contacts us about it. The specific cost is not allowable under award terms, or the cumulative cost in a single budget cost category exceeds the maximum amount that can be reimbursed, and we didn't ask prior to charging those expenditures for a approved sponsor rebudget. So another thing is if a deficit results from a disagreement with a sponsor regarding the scope of performance of work. So the expenditures are for that work, but something's not going great with the work, and so the sponsor may withhold payment until that matter is cleared up, or just may refuse to pay that invoice altogether. And although rare, a sponsor can default on payments due to bankruptcy or unstable financial position. Next slide. So to clear a deficit from a budget so GCA can close out your award, you need to do the following. Cost overruns where expenditures are allowable but cannot be reimbursed. You really want to use a deficit transfer. What's great about the deficit transfer is that it's going to keep your costs intact. So for example, say you're working on like a 5-year project, you want to make sure that the next couple of years you're covered. You can go back to your first budget and kind of see where those cost overruns occurred and plan accordingly or ask for some supplements. If you have approval, however, to pay for these cost overrun expenditures from your renewal award, you will need to do an expense transfer. This occurs a lot for invoiceable awards and at the start of a new competing renewal segment for letter of credit budgets. So this is done through the use of the 90-day pre-award authority. Invoiced awards that use deficit transfers to move cost overruns are usually rejected by the sponsor because they really want to see the individual charges that make up that deficit amount. Unallowable or disallowable costs always need to be removed from the budget using an expense transfer. Cash deficits due to project disputes or bankruptcy can be dealt with using a deficit transfer after GCA has decreased the budget amount to match the payments received from the sponsor. Next slide. So if you do have a deficit, we highly encourage campus to use the automated deficit transfer tool in Grant Tracker for standalone or parent budgets with a deficit balance. It's a wonderful self-service tool, and transfers processed before 4 p.m. will be posted the next business day. And so here's a great screenshot of where the deficit tool is located. So again, this is only going to show up if your budget is in deficit, and it's going to be under the financial information section, and it's going to be that blue link all the way to your right. Next slide. So after you click that link, this is where you're going to be taken to. And as you can see, you're only limited to one budget, but you can use PCS codes if you need to. Next slide. So in cases where you need to transfer the deficit to more than one budget, send us a list of the budgets involved and the corresponding amounts, and we'll take care of that for you. If you need to transfer to or from a sub-budget, please send us a request so we can do that for you. Our automated deficit tool could not be programmed to work with sub-budgets. The coding and development to add that feature was too time-consuming and also expensive. So we will have to do those sub-budget deficit transfers for you. Next slide. So does anyone have any questions?
I don't see any questions currently, but maybe we'll give people a little bit to type.
Oh, okay. So I see two. Okay, so Larry is asking expense transfer scenario questions. Let's say we bought 100 widgets for the benefit of project A, but only use 75 on project A and have project B that will benefit from the remaining 25. Can we transfer the expense of the 25 batteries from project A to project B? Let's see. Yeah, you should be able to, because again, you know, one of the things you really want to keep in mind is that reasonable, allocable, and allowable. So if you can prove that those widgets also benefited project B, you should be able to transfer them. Again, you want to be careful. You feel free to always reach out to GCA and just double check. Just to make sure that we're looking at the terms and conditions. You know, some sponsors can be kind of weird about that kind of thing, especially if it may or may not have been part of the original scope of work. But, you know, saying that this is part of the scope of work and you were going to buy widgets anyway, I would say that it is allowable. Let's see. And then you're welcome. And then Hannah, do you mean deficit transfers for subs? Yes. So for sub budgets, you're not going to see that link, even though that your budget is in deficit. Again, it's a programming thing. So it's not that you can't do it. So if you have a sub budget and it's in deficit, we can take care of that for you. Also, another thing I want to point out is sometimes you may get an outreach from one of our reporting or invoicing team members asking about the deficit. We just want to make sure that it can either be covered by the parent, and this is in cases where the parent and sub are two different departments, or if the sub budget department is supposed to take care of that deficit. And if they are, of course, they can reach out and then we'll go ahead and work with them for the deficit transfer. We don't always want to assume we can just roll that up into the parent. So you might get some extra questions from us at closeout regarding that. Great question. All right. Any other questions? All right, thank you guys.
All right, so moving on. Next, we have surplus budgets with Susan.
Okay, thank you. So you've got a case where you have a budget that's closing and you have cash on hand. Can almost guarantee your PI is going to come to you and say, can we keep it? Next slide. And a quick note before we dive in, this, when I talk about keeping cash, it does not apply to all unspent balances. If your budget is cost reimbursable or letter of credit, which the two of those do form the vast majority of grant budgets, Even if the award is not fully spent, there's not going to be a cash balance on hand that we will need to either refund or transfer to surplus, because we only invoice or draw down for actual expenditures. An unspent balance means you didn't spend all of the available funds, but since we didn't invoice for those funds, we don't have that cash. Typically, budgets that have balances that are eligible for surplus transfer are going to be either milestone, scheduled payment, or what we call form of payment 11, which increases as money comes in. And these are typically clinical trial budgets or capitation sub-budgets. Next slide. So great, you have a milestone budget. It's closing with cash on hand. That means we can keep it, right? Well, not necessarily. Maybe not even most of the time. I would say it's rarer than otherwise to be able to actually keep a balance. You want to look at your award agreement for language like firm fixed price, or the university may retain any unspent balance to support the PI's ongoing research. You'll see some cases where we can retain a balance, but only up to a maximum amount. Say if you have the award allows you to keep a surplus up to 1,000, but you end up with a surplus balance of 2,000, we'll be transferring half of that to a surplus budget and refunding half to the sponsor. Another place you can look for this information is you can look at the budget type and class, which is something you can find in Grant Tracker, and with a little more digging in the MyFD budget profile. And typically we can keep balances if the type and class are 0514, 0531, or 0535. Next slide. Another place to check is your FA notification that you get when the award is first set up. The screenshot here is from the second page of an FA notification. This is a case where we have a milestone budget, but we have to return the balance to the sponsor per the terms of the award agreement. Next slide. So if your award does not contain similar language, firm fixed price or UW may retain, and is not a clinical trial or capitation budget, the balance will almost certainly need to be returned to the sponsor. We do see a handful of cases where a sponsor tells us we can retain a balance when we contact them to say, we believe you're due a refund, please give us the information on how to return it. And sometimes they will come back and say, you can keep that, but don't count on it. To be eligible for surplus transfer, the remaining balance needs to be at least $25. And if the balance is greater than 25% of the total payments received, the department must provide justification for why there's such an excessive balance before we can make the transfer. Next slide. So you're sure you can keep the balance. What happens next? We have to transfer this balance to a fixed price surplus budget, which is identifiable as having type class 0534. And there are no exceptions to this. We'll fairly commonly get someone asking if they can transfer the balance to a particular gift budget or a particular departmental budget. And the answer is going to be no. It has to be a fixed price surplus budget only. We will check your org code at the 4th or 5th level for existing surplus budgets. We will, if that balance is between $25 and $1,000, we will transfer the balance to the surplus budget that has the closest F&A rate. If the balance is over $1,000, we will transfer it to the budget with the closest F&A rate if that rate is within 10% of the award budgets. Next slide. And if your org code has no surplus budget in place or none with an F&A rate within 10% of the awards for a balance greater than $1,000, you must request a new surplus budget. The surplus budget request form is available for download at the link here. These slides will be going up on our website in the next day or two, so you can get to them from there. And the surplus balance will be transferred to that surplus budget once the budget is closed to status 4. So it won't necessarily happen immediately if your budget has just ended. It will be when the closeout process for that budget is complete. Next slide. One other important thing to keep in mind, when we're setting up a fixed price surplus budget, the PI is going to be listed as the dean, director, or chair rather than an individual PI. The reason for this is there's an expectation that these funds are for the benefit of the university rather for an individual PI. For example, if that PI leaves UW for another institution in a year or two, those surplus funds are going to remain with UW and be eligible for appropriate spending from the surplus budget. The dean director or chair has the authority to direct the use of funds at the request of the individual PI. So this is basically to say that you can set up whatever internal tracking system is appropriate to see how a PI, the funds that originated from a PI is spent, but we can't list the awards PI as a surplus budget PI. Next slide. Resource for you. We have a fixed price surplus page. It's part of the GCA homepage and the link is here. Next slide. Are there any questions?
I don't see any currently, but we can give people a few seconds to type. Not seeing anything come through, so.
All right, and moving on. Now we have end of award, non-traditional endings with Cheryl.
Thanks, Michelle. So I've kind of noticed that, there's feels like with what they call it, the Great Resignation, there's actually a lot of movement out there on campus. And so we thought maybe it's a good time to talk about relinquishing awards and early terminations, because I think there was a nice period of time where they were kind of confusing. At least they were for me. So what we have is like, what's the difference? So an early termination is the project is being terminated early. And I'll go into more detail later. And a relinquishment and an award transfer kind of are hand in hand. And that's typically when the PI is going to a new institution and the award is going with them. Unlike the surplus Susan just mentioned. All right, next slide, please. So one thing that has occurred in the last 5 years, OSP has a really nice intake form to kind of help move through these two processes. And I think they help a lot. This is located on OSP's website, and it's under resources. There's a tab across the top, and it's forms and templates, and it will take you to where you can search all the forms in OSP. The particular one I'm talking about is the end of award request form. Okay, next slide. So as promised, an early termination is you're shortening the life of the project prior to the completion. Common reasons are that we see is that maybe it's a clinical trial and it's not going as planned, and everybody agrees we need to stop this right now. Perhaps the PI is unable to complete the project. Sometimes things happen where the PI is unable to complete the work, various reasons. There could be a financial reason. Sometimes, like if the sponsor is maybe going to go bankrupt or is experiencing problems, that can be an issue. And then there's some other reasons, renewals and overlapping. So they may deobligate or kind of shorten this period because they're doing something in the next period. They want to do some kind of, we call it zhuzhing of the money. An early termination may also involve a deobligation. So in that prior example, they may take away money and time from this period because they're going to add it to the next, or maybe they're just like, nope, it's over and we're moving on. Okay, the next slide. So on the form, I just took a little screenshot. This is the early termination portion. It's really nice and clean, and there's usually a letter or an email from the sponsor that goes along with this. And so you'll just kind of put whatever everybody's agreed on what the new termination date is. And this form will go to OSP when it's signed and completed. Okay, so that's the early termination. The next slide. This is the one that's the trickiest, I think. A relinquishment is the PIs leaving our institution, and the trickiest is when the new institution or wherever they're moving to is going to be taking over the award. And I think the reason it's tricky is because there's a couple different processes depending on who the sponsor is. One question that we get sometimes is, why doesn't the UW just send the money to where I'm going? And that is absolutely not how this goes. Basically, the university needs to wrap our award up and return everything back to the sponsor, who then will issue a brand new award to the new institution. So the end date will be, of course, shortened, and we have to then go through all the closeout documentation and process and make sure that we still are meeting the terms and conditions of the revised award. One thing we say, if you find out your PI is leaving, I put a little extra focus on their work to make sure that you get everything you need from them, any reports, timesheet information or allocation type stuff before they leave, because they're excited. They're moving on to something different, and you might be stuck a couple months later trying to get some information. Next slide. So the second part of OSP's form, it's for relinquishments and transfers. The new end date is the PI's last day at the University of Washington. So that's what you'll put in there. And you're going to also note I've highlighted, there's a section here that says, if you have to do an estimate of how much you can let go at this time or relinquish, if you have any questions about that, we say call GCA help. As a best practice, keep more money than you think you need. What we've seen over the years is where people have tried to relinquish exactly to the penny what they think what they think can go to the new institution. And invariably there's like a subcontractor charge will come in, or, keeping in mind that everything's been accelerated now. The subcontracts, any of those are getting terminated early, which puts pressure on those, our subcontractors. And so there's been a surprise. And what is not a surprise is that it's really hard to get your money back after you've said it can go. So we say, whatever you think, if the award's $100,000 at this very moment, you've spent $50,000 and you think there's not going to be anything more, only relinquish $25,000. That's enough to get things started at the other end. And they'll get the balance later. And this is in the case where you have to fill out this estimate. Next slide. So who makes you fill out that estimate? It's NIH. So NIH's process is more complicated than really it needs to be. Okay, personal opinion. So what they're going to do is they're going to take your estimate of what you can relinquish, what the UW is willing to give up at this very minute, and they will send an amendment that deobligates from us the amount that we've said we could relinquish. And they will also ask the new entity to go through the process of applying for this award. And as you guys know, pre-award proposals, they're going through that exact process to get this. So it takes a long time for NIH to approve, and sometimes they do not approve the new institution. And so in an ideal NIH world, the way it goes, we've relinquished $25,000 in my example there. And so that will be their initial award amount. The University of Washington goes through our closing process. And at the end, we realize, we spent an additional $5,000 that we hadn't expected, which means there's $20,000 still remaining. When we file our final report, we are letting NIH know that's the case, and they will then send a supplement for that $20,000 so that, at the end of whatever we're talking here, 3 to 6 months, the new institution and the PI will have 100% of the unspent balance. And it works, and that's how that goes. So for everyone else, they basically send an amendment with the new end date, which is the PI's last day, and we just go through the normal closing process so that at the end of 90 days, or typically 60 days, everybody's done. If there is any cash, we will refund it to the sponsor. I will also add that sometimes we do have a couple sponsors that they're big, and what they do is they pay up front, and they will ask us to send the balance to the new institution, and we will do that for them. It's pretty much Gates, but we've gotten all of our paperwork in, and we have a written letter from them. So that's the one that works. So you can really kind of see the difference between the two processes. So hopefully that makes sense. And then I did put my little sad person with the cloud, because if you do give away too much money to NIH, it's hard to get it back. Okay, the next slide. There's a couple other non-traditional type ways budgets can end, and I think we've kind of talked about them a little bit, but I can go over. One, Susan talked about a fixed price award that has a remaining balance that's over 25%. There was a period of time where all of these required a post-award change, a PAC from OSP, and we no longer require that. You can just, GCA will ask you, we're going to ask you to confirm that the project was completed. We're going to ask you for that brief statement about why the unspent balance was high or excessive, meaning it greater than 25%. And we're going to ask you which surplus budget to use. And as Susan already kind of talked about, the IDC rate should match or be within 10% of the awards IDC, the awards IDC rate. Next. A deobligation, we used to have you fill out a form for these, and then we all realized, wait a minute, the sponsor just needs to amend the agreement and we're all good. And so that's how those go now. I say now, but it's been this way for at least a year or two. OSP will they get the amended document that says your award was this amount, we're reducing it by this amount, here's your new total. They send it down to GCA, who updates the system. Okay, next slide. All right, any questions?
We have one from Grace Young. For the relinquishment process, if the letter or form is submitted, then the dollar value changes. Are you required to sign all the forms again?
No. So for NIH, because really they're the ones that make you fill out that form, the way it kind of goes is you give your estimate, and it's supposedly just an estimate, but it's a firm estimate from our point of view, meaning whatever you give away, we will probably not get back. And then the second part of the money, the true remaining balance will be sent later after and it's not really money, it's just an unspent balance. That will be relinquished with the final report. It's that part's automatic.
Grace posted a follow-up saying that OSP is currently having her sign the forms 2 times with the chair.
Maybe, I don't know about that. It's you might have to redo it. I think I've seen that before where there's something going on there. But like maybe too much was relinquished, or I'm not sure. Grace, maybe you can send us an email or something with the budget, and I'd be happy to take a look-see at that. But most of the time it's usually kind of a one-time form, but it's not uncommon to have to fill it out a few times before we get it right, because that's why we always say, call GCA, we'll help. Oh. Is there,
I am not seeing any other questions.
okay. And I see Adelia. I didn't know if you wanted to join in the reindeer games here.
Sorry, I was trying to chime in, and Lori said it's hard to hear me, so maybe my microphone isn't working real well. Can you hear me okay now?
Sort of.
I just typed in the chat that it depends on the situation. If there's a big change in, say, dollar amount or something on the form change from drastically. You can't hear me, can you?
Yeah, it is. It's hard. It is hard to hear you. But I heard you say it depends on the situation and what is being changed. And I think that's sort of where I was going with that too. And so I would say, Grace, send an email to us here at GCA Help, and then with the budget number, and maybe I can, Adelia and you and I can figure that out. Oh, yeah. Okay. And Adelia is also offering her help too, which of course I roped her in. So. All right. Are there any other questions for us? This is a good one. All right. Michelle, I think you can wrap it up.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions, a quick shout out that our next forum is going to be in August by Zoom, and we'll send out details closer to that date. And in the meantime, you can also check out our past forum slides or recordings on our website, the links here. And then following this forum, we're going to send out a survey. So if you can fill that out, that'd be great. And let us know if there are any topics you would like us to cover in the future. And then finally, if you have further questions for us that weren't answered here that you think of later, feel free to reach out to us. You can contact us through Grant Tracker, email, or by calling GCA Help. And unless anyone else has any last minute questions, I think that's all.
Yeah, if you want to just go ahead and stop the share.